Blood was already pooling across the apartment floor while his ears rang from shots that refused to fade, and somewhere nearby, voices overlapped in panic, disbelief, and shouting that made no sense anymore. His legs would not respond the way his mind expected, and every breath felt borrowed, as if somebody else still needed it more. He could see bodies that were not moving, faces he recognized but could not focus on, and walls that looked closer than they should have been. Whatever protection money once promised had already disappeared, and whatever plan existed before that night no longer applied. Nothing felt finished, yet nothing felt reversible either, which made that moment stick long after the pain settled in. The memory of that floor does not start in that apartment, even though it feels like the beginning when people tell it backward, since the real starting point sat several decades earlier in Sugar Hill, where Ozzie Faison Jr. learned scarcity before learning confidence. He was born on November 10, 1964, into a Harlem household stretched thin by 7 children, one exhausted mother, and a father whose drinking and violence eventually erased him from daily life. Their apartment barely held everyone at night, forcing siblings to rotate sleeping spots while hunger stayed consistent enough to feel normal. Poverty was not an idea in that home. It was a routine that shaped how days were planned and how expectations stayed small. His mother relied on public assistance, neighbors, and quiet endurance, while Ozzie learned early that embarrassment carried weight even when nobody spoke it out loud. He noticed which classmates had full lunches and which teachers avoided eye contact when field trips required money, and those moments built a quiet anger that never fully surfaced. A fire in 1970 burned their apartment and pushed the family into temporary displacement, reinforcing the idea that stability could vanish without warning. Digging through ashes for salvaged belongings left impressions that followed him far longer than toys ever could. Nothing felt permanent enough to protect, which quietly influenced how risk later felt manageable. School never offered relief, since classrooms reflected the same lack he saw at home, only framed as preparation rather than consequence. Public School 46 did not hold his attention, not through defiance, but through disinterest, as lessons felt detached from survival. By age 12, he was already skipping classes to find small ways to contribute money, shining shoes, sweeping storefronts, and pumping gas for change. Carrying laundry bags for 50-cent tips taught him that effort did not always equal progress, which created frustration rather than discipline. Those early hustles were not about ambition. They were about minimizing discomfort and keeping embarrassment manageable. His father's absence created silence rather than closure, leaving behind conflicting messages that surfaced later during brief reappearances filled with judgment rather than support. When his father eventually rejected money earned through illegal work, the contradiction only deepened the divide, since moral refusal did not erase material need. AZ learned to compartmentalize emotion early, separating survival from approval, which made later decisions easier to rationalize internally. He did not grow up dreaming of power or dominance. He grew up focused on avoiding the same ceiling his mother kept hitting. That difference matters, since desperation often looks like ambition once money enters the picture. By the time adolescence arrived, Harlem itself was changing around him, shaped by disinvestment, abandoned buildings, and older hustlers who moved differently than working adults. Their confidence filled the space quickly, and their presence suggested an alternative structure that did not involve waiting. Watching his mother struggle without complaint made him resistant to long-term patience, even when patience felt safer. Survival thinking formed quietly, reinforced daily by what he lacked rather than what he wanted. When opportunity later appeared, it did not feel like a moral fork, it felt like a continuation. Before AZ ever handled product, he studied how the street rewarded visibility noting how older hustlers moved through Harlem with ease that ordinary workers never carried. Expensive coats, clean cars, and unbothered posture translated into respect faster than education or credentials ever did. Corners functioned like stages, where presence alone established hierarchy without conversation. Younger kids absorbed these cues instinctively, understanding that the image traveled faster than explanation. AZ stayed close enough to observe without stepping in, learning rules without announcing interest. Movies and music reinforced the same lessons without directly instructing them, especially when Scarface hit theaters in December 1983 and spread through Harlem like shared language. Tony Montana's rise did not register as fantasy, since the outline already felt familiar to kids watching real-life versions daily. Lines from the movie echoed on subway rides and stairwells, blending fiction with lived experience until separation stopped mattering. The message that power came through fear and money arrived packaged as entertainment, which made it easier to digest without questioning. AZ did not idolize the character blindly, but he recognized how closely it mirrored what he already saw. Hip-hop culture amplified the same ecosystem, connecting fashion, confidence, and independence into a single identity that felt accessible. Leather jackets, gold chains, and tailored fits communicated success faster than resumes ever could, while lyrics narrated environments that listeners recognized immediately. Street legends like Nicky Barnes and Pee Wee Kirkland circulated as cautionary tales mixed with admiration, rarely separated cleanly. Respect followed those who appeared untouchable, regardless of consequences whispered later. AZ noticed that nobody waited for permission in those stories. They simply moved. He paid attention to how money created insulation, watching how people deferred, smiled differently, and looked away when certain figures passed by. Violence existed in the background, but it did not dominate conversations the way success did, which made risk feel abstract. Nobody talked about prison until someone disappeared, and even then, the discussion moved quickly. The environment rewarded decisiveness, not hesitation, which shaped how young observers evaluated options. AZ learned that hesitation often read as weakness rather than caution. Remaining on the outside gave him perspective, allowing patterns to surface before participation blurred them. He saw how partnerships formed around access, not loyalty, and how generosity bought silence more effectively than threats. Trust seemed transactional, maintained only as long as money flowed correctly. These observations shaped his approach later, emphasizing structure over impulse. Long before he touched cocaine, he understood the mechanics that governed its world. By the time opportunity arrived, it did not feel sudden, since the groundwork had already been laid through years of watching and absorbing. The street had already explained its rules without ever inviting him formally. What followed did not begin as a rebellion. It followed a path that felt logical, given everything already learned. Understanding came before action, which made the step forward feel smaller than outsiders later assumed. The game had already introduced itself long before he decided to play. The first real door did not swing open with celebration or adrenaline, since it came through a quiet introduction to a Dominican supplier everyone called Lulu, who operated with precision rather than noise. Lulu was not flashy, did not argue, and did not rush conversation, which immediately separated him from street sellers who relied on volume and bravado. He fronted small amounts of powder cocaine on strict terms, making it clear that repayment timelines mattered more than personality or promises. AZ understood that structure immediately, recognizing that reliability created access faster than charm ever could. That first exchange was not emotional, it was transactional, which made it feel manageable rather than dangerous. Fronting changed everything once the initial sale cleared cleanly. since returning with full payment on time established trust without conversation. Lulu increased quantities gradually, watching consistency rather than enthusiasm, which aligned with Azia's preference for control. The work shifted quickly from single flips to repeat cycles that shortened the time between transactions, making money feel less dramatic and more routine. Cooking powder into crack introduced new layers of responsibility, requiring accuracy, cleanliness, and patience that reckless sellers often ignored. AZ focused on process early, treating production like work instead of an opportunity. He avoided using product, discouraged sloppy behavior around inventory, and paid back suppliers before spending on himself, which protected access when others burned bridges. Digital scales replaced eyeballing, gloves replaced bare hands, and rotating stash locations reduced exposure without drawing attention. Early recruits were selected for discretion rather than aggression, since loudness created visibility nobody needed. Speed began replacing caution once sales stabilized, though the discipline remained intact longer than most expected. Success did not announce itself, it crept into routine through repetition. Margins widened as quantities increased, shifting Ozzy from retail involvement towards supply coordination, which insulated him from street-level volatility. He paid workers daily, reduced disputes through clear expectations, and kept debts minimal to avoid leverage against himself. Lulu rewarded consistency with better pricing, which allowed reinvestment without stretching risk. That feedback loop accelerated growth quietly, making expansion feel earned rather than reckless. Within a short span, the operation outgrew casual classification and entered wholesale territory without ceremony. What felt temporary at first quickly hardened into normalcy as money stopped feeling surprising and started feeling expected. The danger did not disappear, but it blended into background awareness rather than immediate fear. Caution still existed, yet it no longer slowed decisions the way it once did. Each successful cycle reinforced confidence that the structure could outpace consequence. That assumption would matter later, even if it went unspoken at the time. By the time others noticed movement, the foundation had already settled, making disruption harder than outsiders realized. Lulu remained a supplier, not a partner, which kept boundaries clear while maintaining flow. AZ understood that emotional attachment complicated business, so he avoided blending loyalty with access. The door that opened did not slam shut behind him, since every completed exchange widened it further. What began as survival quietly became infrastructure before anyone labeled it ambition. Richard Porter entered the picture through proximity rather than strategy, crossing paths with AZ during neighborhood gambling sessions where reputation traveled faster than introductions. Rich already carried a presence, wearing designer clothing confidently while moving through Harlem as the environment belonged to him. He understood street psychology instinctively, knowing how visibility influenced respect and how generosity created loyalty. Unlike Ozzy, Rich enjoyed attention and leaned into it, treating image as currency rather than liability. That contrast made their partnership functional early, since each filled gaps the other avoided. Rich lacked a consistent supply, while AZ needed distribution reach, which aligned their interests without requiring trust at first. They split responsibilities naturally, with Rich managing retail networks and AZ coordinating product flow behind the scenes. Money moved faster once those roles stabilized, reinforcing the belief that the separation of duties reduced friction. Rich handled people effortlessly, resolving disputes through charisma rather than force, which kept operations smoother than competitors. His face became associated with success, even when structure supported it quietly underneath. Alberto Martinez, known as Alpo, arrived differently, pushing himself into proximity through persistence rather than invitation. Younger, sharper, and visibly restless, he studied both men carefully before securing a role. Alpo brought a willingness to enforce boundaries violently, which added a pressure that others hesitated to apply. He thrived in chaos, enjoying risk in ways that unsettled calmer partners. That intensity filled a need while introducing instability nobody named directly. Ozzy positioned himself between them as coordinator, controlling supply flow and financial pacing to balance their opposing energies. Rich elevated reputation outward, Alpo compressed pressure inward, and Ozzy maintained equilibrium through access and restraint. Early success masked friction, since profits smoothed over differences without resolving them. Jealousy did not announce itself. It surfaced quietly through questions about pricing, access, and credit. Money amplified perception, making minor imbalances feel intentional even when they were structural. As operations expanded, subtle distrust formed around numbers rather than actions, with whispers suggesting overcharging or skimming without evidence. Alpo questioned margins, suspecting information asymmetry favored others, while Rich assumed loyalty where verification would have been safer. AZ recognized tension but prioritized stability, believing structure would outpace emotion. None of them wanted conflict, yet none addressed the underlying resentment directly. Silence became a temporary solution that hardened into a habit. Reputation chasing intensified once profits became visible, drawing attention from rivals and admirers alike. Rich enjoyed recognition and leaned into generosity, reinforcing his image as a neighborhood provider. Alpo interpreted respect as dominance, measuring worth through fear and enforcement. AZ measures success through continuity, focusing on keeping systems intact despite growing personalities. These interpretations did not clash openly, yet they pulled the operation in competing directions. Money continued flowing, masking instability while magnifying egos beneath the surface. Decisions grew faster, patience shortened, and assumptions replaced communication. Trust existed, though it relied increasingly on momentum rather than understanding. What worked initially now depended on alignment that no longer existed organically. The operation strengthened financially while weakening internally, creating tension nobody addressed openly. By the time success felt permanent, the balance had already shifted beyond easy correction. Each man believed the operation relied on his contribution most, even when evidence suggested interdependence. That belief did not create immediate conflict, but it reframed loyalty as leverage. The structure still held, though stress fractures formed quietly within it. What came next did not arrive suddenly. It followed trajectories already set in motion. By the mid-80s, Harlem felt louder even during quiet hours, since money circulating through crack houses changed movement patterns, daily routines, and expectations around who controlled which blocks. Stash houses multiplied quietly, tucked into apartments rented through girlfriends, cousins, or borrowed names, rotating often enough to stay ahead of attention. Locations shifted weekly, sometimes daily, creating a constant low-grade anxiety that blended into routine. Workers memorized routes, knock patterns, and backup exits, treating logistics like muscle memory rather than strategy. That normalization made risk feel ordinary, which lowered defenses without anyone realizing it. Rival crews watched carefully, measuring growth through rumors rather than evidence, then testing boundaries through intimidation that rarely stayed verbal. Guns appeared everywhere, not as threats, but as accessories, tucked casually into waistbands during conversations about rent or deliveries. The presence of weapons did not signal imminent violence anymore. It signaled preparedness, which reduced hesitation while increasing volatility. Paranoia crept in through small inconsistencies, like unfamiliar cars idling too long or faces lingering outside buildings. Nobody panicked, yet nobody relaxed either, since vigilance replaced trust gradually. Money reached the neighborhood unevenly, creating visible contrasts that fueled admiration alongside resentment. Some families received groceries, rent help, or holiday gifts delivered without explanation, which earned gratitude and silence. Basketball tournaments, school supplies, and cash handed to struggling neighbors softened public perception, at least temporarily. At the same time, addiction hollowed out households nearby, filling emergency rooms and funerals with familiar names. Protection and damage coexisted closely, making moral clarity difficult for people navigating survival daily. Police presence increased, though rarely predictably, forcing operations to adapt through timing rather than concealment. Lookouts blended into street life, communicating danger through posture and movement rather than radios. The operation adjusted continuously, refining schedules, separating roles, and limiting exposure without slowing flow. Profits peaked during this period, reinforcing the belief that adaptation could outpace consequence indefinitely. That confidence felt justified until it quietly stopped being accurate. Pressure accumulated from multiple directions, even when revenue stayed strong, since success attracted scrutiny from allies and enemies alike. Internal patience shortened as external threats multiplied, making small mistakes more consequential. Nobody wanted disruption, yet disruption felt inevitable given the pace. Violence moved faster than planning, reacting to perceived slights before verification occurred. The environment felt crowded with possibilities and danger, compressing time until decisions happened automatically. The stash house that night in 1987 followed routines refined through repetition, which made the breach feel unreal once it happened. People gathered to count money and prepare products, trusting familiarity over caution while assuming patterns still held. Kevin Clark, a longtime associate with access and resentment, knew schedules well enough to exploit them. Planning failed quietly through assumptions, since familiarity replaced verification and trust filled the gaps in the structure once occupied. The door opening did not register as a danger until it was already too late. Gunfire erupted abruptly, turning the confined space into chaos that no plane addressed effectively. Shots struck bodies without preference, collapsing years of strategy into seconds of confusion. AZ was hit multiple times, bullets tearing through legs, arms, and back, dropping him where money once promised insulation. Others did not survive long enough to understand what happened, their presence ending abruptly amid shouting and smoke. Survival felt random rather than earned, stripping meaning from prior discipline. Robbers grabbed cash and product quickly, moving with urgency rather than celebration, suggesting desperation more than confidence. The aftermath left silence broken only by pain and disbelief, since adrenaline faded faster than injuries. AZ dragged himself toward help, pounding on doors until consciousness faded, relying on neighbors rather than associates. Emergency responders arrived at scenes stripped of context, reading damage without understanding the cause. Consequence replaced momentum immediately, without negotiation. Hospitalization slowed time enough to force reflection, as surgeries removed bullets while leaving others embedded permanently. Weeks passed under fluorescent lights, filled with pain management and restricted movement that erased illusions of control. Law enforcement visits brought questions without comfort, hinting at a tension that could not be avoided anymore. Friends visited cautiously, measuring loyalty against risk in every conversation. Recovery introduced distance between survival and continuation, reframing priorities without announcing decisions. The psychological shift did not arrive as a revelation. It settled gradually through discomfort and limitation. Lying immobilized made outcomes visible in ways success never allowed, connecting earlier choices to present reality clearly. Fear replaced confidence, not dramatically, but persistently, altering how the future looked. The operation continued outside, yet Ozzy's position within it changed irreversibly. The night did not end the story, but it redirected it permanently. By the late 80s, turning into 1989, the street rules shifted again, since a crew called the Preacher Crew started operating outside normal drug war expectations. Clarence Preacher Heatley and his people did not care about territory pride or supplier politics, focusing instead on leverage through fear. Their specialty involved kidnapping relatives of dealers, targeting families rather than rivals to extract control through pain. This tactic disrupted balance, since money no longer insulated loved ones from consequence. Once that line appeared crossed, every operation in Harlem felt exposed. The kidnapping of Donald Porter, Rich Porter's 12-year-old half-brother, landed heavily even among people accustomed to violence. Donald disappeared on December 5, 1989, grabbed while heading to school and pulled into a van without warning. The demand followed quickly, with a ransom amount reportedly reaching $500,000, a number meant to crush confidence rather than invite negotiation. Phone calls arrived filled with threats delivered calmly, reinforcing that this was business to the kidnappers. That calm terrified people more than shouting ever could. The tape arrived soon after, containing Donald's voice pleading for help, a recording that shifted everything emotionally. Hearing a child cry removed abstraction, forcing reality into spaces money previously controlled. When the finger arrived, cut clean and delivered as proof, denial stopped being an option. Rich scrambled to raise funds, reaching out to associates and allies, including AZ, who contributed but understood payment did not guarantee safety. Control slipped further with every hour, as leverage belonged entirely to the kidnappers. Law enforcement pressure increased through the C-11 task force, complicating decisions without offering clear solutions. Cooperating risked exposure, while silence risked a child's life, creating paralysis rather than clarity. Negotiations dragged on, marked by delays and miscommunication, allowing the Preacher Crew to dictate the pace. Eventually, Donald was killed, his body dumped near the Hutchinson River Parkway, ending hope without ceremony. The message landed brutally, confirming that money could not always buy resolution. Grief rippled through Harlem differently than previous violence, since a child's death stripped justification from everything surrounding it. Candlelight vigils replaced bravado, and conversations shifted toward fear rather than respect. For Rich, the loss fractured something internal, intensifying paranoia already simmering beneath success. Trust narrowed further, with suspicion turning inward toward partners rather than outward toward enemies. That inward pressure accelerated the collapse more effectively than any rival attack. The murder of Rich Porter followed quickly on January 3, 1990, without a warning that felt adequate in hindsight. Alpo Martinez invited Rich for a drive, a normal gesture masking irreversible intent. Somewhere along the Harlem River Drive, Alpo shot Rich inside the vehicle, firing again to ensure completion. The body was dumped near Orchard Beach, discovered days later with jewelry still intact. That detail suggested a motive rooted in control rather than robbery. Alpo later framed the killing as preemptive, claiming fear of betrayal over cocaine, pricing, and loyalty. Jealousy, resentment, and unchecked ego collided, producing an outcome neither structure nor success could prevent. The murder closed a chapter that began with cooperation and ended with isolation. There was no ceremony, no warning, just removal. In one act, the partnership turned fatal, proving paranoia eventually consumes even its architects. After Rich's death, AZ understood Continuation meant narrowing the odds he no longer wanted to calculate. The combination of betrayal, family targeting, and randomness made the exit feel less optional. He stepped away quietly in early 1990, reducing involvement without public announcement. The remaining product was sold off, connections loosened, and communication slowed deliberately. Departure did not bring relief immediately, since attention lingered longer than participation. Rumors followed quickly, filling the silence with speculation that demanded answers nobody provided. Accusations of cooperation surfaced, tied to his testimony during the 1987 robbery trial involving Kevin Clark. Street logic framed survival itself as evidence, ignoring timing and circumstance. AZ denied working as an informant, pointing to a lack of paperwork or deals, though doubt persisted regardless. Silence became its own sentence, forcing distance from narratives he could not control. Stories about hidden money circulated alongside accusations, claiming millions buried in coffee cans across New York. Those myths reflected disbelief that anyone would walk away voluntarily without secret wealth. Medical bills, legal expenses, and years of spending contradicted that fantasy, yet legends traveled faster than facts. AZ lived modestly, avoiding displays that might reignite attention. Skepticism remained, though proof never surfaced. Redirecting energy came through music rather than retreat, forming the group Mob Style with local rappers. Their work reflected lived experience without celebrating it, addressing paranoia, loss, and consequence directly. The album Streetwise was released in 1991, selling independently through trunk distribution and small shows. Songs referenced real events without disguising cost, functioning more as documentation than bragging. Music offered voice without authority, allowing participation without command. The film was followed later by the documentary Game Over, produced with Troy Reed, presenting events from multiple perspectives. Law enforcement commentary added context, grounding the narrative beyond street memory. Consulting on paid and full connected AZ to a fictionalized retelling, though he criticized glamorization publicly. Participation did not equal endorsement, reflecting a desire to influence portrayal without dictating reception. He remained adjacent to the story, visible but not central. Activism emerged gradually, focusing on speaking engagements at schools and detention centers. AZ addressed the youth directly, emphasizing how outcomes rarely matched expectations promised early. He avoided moral lectures, relying instead on chronology and consequence. Business ventures stayed legal and low profile, supporting the family without rebuilding notoriety. Redemption was never claimed explicitly, leaving interpretation to observers. Walking away did not erase history, since the past remained active through culture and rumor. Alpo's later cooperation and eventual death in 2021 reopened discussions without resolving them. AZ continued, speaking cautiously, refusing to validate narratives, seeking closure. Distance replaced dominance, marking a transition without celebration. Life never truly released him, though control shifted enough to survive. When the memory circles back to that apartment floor, the scene finally carries weight earned through everything that followed, not shock borrowed from the moment itself. The blood, the silence, and the confusion no longer stand alone, since they now connect to years of movement that made collapse feel inevitable. Survival did not arrive as victory, since it demanded distance rather than dominance, reshaping how life unfolded afterward. What remained was awareness that momentum, once mistaken for control, had limits that appeared without warning. That understanding did not provide peace, only clarity heavy enough to carry forward. Living past the chaos required adjustment rather than applause, since nobody throws celebrations for people who simply stop falling. AZ moved through later years with reduced volume, watching stories retell themselves through voices no longer his own. Legacy formed unevenly, shaped by movies, music, and rumors that reassembled events into versions easier to consume. Control over narrative slipped away gradually, replaced by interpretations that rarely matched lived experience. That loss mirrored earlier lessons about ownership and permanence. Alpo's later death in 2021 reopened conversations without offering resolution, stirring speculation rather than closure. Some treated it as a delayed consequence, others as a coincidence unrelated to history, though neither explanation satisfied everyone listening. The streets rarely agree on meaning, preferring continuity over answers that feel final. That ambiguity reflected how stories survive longer than individuals, reshaped by whoever speaks loudest at the moment. No ending arrived that tied threads neatly together. Rumors persisted alongside documented facts, blending into a shared mythology resistant to correction. Accusations, buried money legends, and questions about cooperation continued circulating, even as evidence failed to settle debates. Silence remained the default response, not as admission, but as recognition that explanation rarely quiets curiosity. The past stayed active through conversation, referenced by people who never lived inside it. Memory outpaced truth without malice, simply following demand. Cultural reinterpretations kept resurfacing, especially through hip-hop and film, framing earlier choices as symbols rather than actions. Characters inspired by real people traveled further than the originals ever could, reinforcing fascination detached from consequence. Audiences absorbed simplified arcs, favoring rise and fall narratives that overlooked lingering aftermath. Those retellings extended influence while removing agency from those depicted. Ownership of the story shifted permanently toward collective imagination. What remains after noise fades is not a moral lesson, since lessons imply endings that never fully arrive. Survival continues quietly, shaped by decisions that still echo through relationships, reputation, and reflection. Choices made under pressure leave residues that time does not erase, only rearranges. Continuity replaces conclusion, carrying weight forward without offering release. The story does not stop, it just moves more slowly, waiting for whoever listens next.